In this video, we're going to talk about moving objects and exposure blending. And in some circumstances, moving objects are relatively easy to deal with. For example, shooting a scene like this, you'll see we have a lot of different things going on. So I've got a brighter exposure here and two darker exposures. We have this guy in the middle, and I quite like him being there, so I think that's okay. But in the darker exposures, to the left, we have someone there. To the right, we have two people talking. And in this other darker exposure, we have even more people. Now, if you were to put this through HDR software, the HDR program wouldn't know how to deal with it. You probably could remove ghosts, but there would be artifacts in your base exposure or in your final image where those ghosts would have been. But with luminosity masking, you don't have any such artifacts. You still have the same quality files. The only thing you need in a scene like this is a little bit of patience, because clearly there's a lot of people around, a lot of tourists. So you just have to sit and wait for things to fall the way you want them to fall. So for example, we've got this guy here. This is great, a good base exposure. But in this darker exposure, as I mentioned, we've got different people in different areas. But in this darker exposure, in those same areas, you'll see they are free. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have this silhouette, but we have nothing there in the other exposure. And these two people talking here don't exist in this exposure too. And it works the same way. So in this top exposure, we have two people talking here. But in that other exposure, we don't have anyone there. So by combining these two exposures, we're going to end up with a darker exposure, a darker layer that doesn't have any moving objects, or certainly none that are blocking our view, because we're going to be using the brighter parts of this image, so the lights and the archways, and putting them in the brighter exposure. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, we create a mask, a white mask on this top layer. We select a black brush with 100% opacity. Let's choose a small brush, and we just paint out the people that are there. And you can see there's kind of a silhouette of a person here. It's a little bit darker. So when I paint, see, we brighten that area a little bit, and there's before and after. Now we have no one blocking these light sources here under the archways. Now to blend this final result into the base exposure, we select both of those dark exposures, press Ctrl and G or Command and G. We hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and create a black mask on that group. Then in Lumi 32, we're just going to select the archways. So we'll go for something like a Brights 3, let's say. Now that's still a little bit too bright. It's affecting the walls along the mosque, which is not what we want. So we can bring the range down. So I've got my range at 32. And if that's okay, we can press Select, Command and H or Control and H, close the panel and choose a white brush. And remember, we've got the black mask selected of that group layer. And I'm just manually painting in the archways. And we can do the archway along here next to this guy. And press Command and D or Control and D when you're finished. Then we can reduce the opacity of that darker exposure. Let's say to around 55%. So there's before and after. Now you'll notice there is some flattening here of the light in the corner. So there's before and after, and that's just because I haven't matched my exposures like we've done in the previous video. So with scenes like this, what we need is a touch of patience. We just need to sit down, be calm if we have the time, that is, and try and capture a base exposure that we like, so this exposure. Then bring our camera down a few stops and take multiple darker exposures until we're sure, after blending them, that we'll have a fairly clear scene. And sometimes this might take 10 exposures. Sometimes it might take 20 or 30. But shooting in a place like this isn't really a chore, so I don't mind taking my time in these situations. So next we have the dreaded moving tree. And this is the one I get asked about the most. When there are branches that are moving because it's windy, how do we blend those exposures? Well, sadly, the short answer is we can't. So when I shot this image, you can see we have the darker exposure here on top and the base exposure at the bottom, and look at the movement between those trees. The way I should have done it is, if this was a better scene and I was more interested in really capturing it, I should have taken my time and just waited for a few seconds for the wind to calm down, which it inevitably would have done, and I would have captured these trees in the same spot. Sometimes, however, we're shooting in golden hour, we've only got a few minutes to work with, we don't have the luxury of sitting still and waiting. In those situations, you're probably going to have to use a single exposure if there's too much movement between these trees. So if I just show you the example of blending these, let's go for a bright swan, create a bit more contrast in that mask, press apply. Then I zoom in to this exposure. You'll see we've got some definite movement between those exposures. So like I say, you're probably going to have to use a single exposure in that workflow. And in the next video, you'll see how to do that in terms of exposure blending rather than just using the sliders in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So just to repeat, if there's moving branches and it's significant, chances are we're not going to be able to blend those exposures. Now, quite often I'll receive emails from photographers saying that they have movement in trees and they're asking how to fix it, but often there isn't any movement in the trees when I look at the example that they've shown me. And let me recreate the problem here. So I've got the dark exposure invisible. I open Lumi 32 and I'll create a bright swan. And let's just apply that. And we can zoom in to our base exposure. So you see the movement here, or you see the faint markings here on the tree. So there's before and after. It gives you the impression that there's some sort of movement. And the vast majority of times, that's what I see when people send me their example files. But that's not really movement. That's just because the trees in the brighter exposure are clipped. And so when you're blending in the darker exposure, it looks strange. Let me show you a more exaggerated form of that. So if I bring the highlights down even more, maybe even bring this exposure down a little bit more too. So there's a more extreme version of that. And we saw that to some degree in the long exposure workflow that we did in the last video. And as you already know, the way to fix that is by reducing the opacity of the darker exposure, but more likely it's through matching. So let's just show you how I would match these exposures. So let's go for default to start off with. And I'm going to bring these shadows up a tiny bit. We don't need to do it too much. And bring down the highlights quite a bit because the sky is gorgeous up there. How about giving this scene a tiny bit more warmth? Not too much, actually. Maybe a bit more pink. And then pressing OK. And then in the base exposure, we can reduce the highlights a lot. So this is what the highlights were. And this is when we reduce the highlights. You see, we return those trees back into the image. They're not clipped anymore. So if we press OK, watch the tree here. You see? Now those look a little bit more natural. That was before and that was after. They still don't look perfect. So let's go back into that base exposure and let's bring down the exposure value of that exposure and bring up the shadows a tiny bit, not too much. And so we're darkening the trees roughly to the same level as the darker exposure. And look at that. That's completely neutralized that strange edging that we saw before. So there's before and there's after. And all we're doing is bringing the brightness level of the darker and brighter exposure closer together. So here's before and after blending. Now I would say that dark exposure is probably a little bit too dark. So instead of reducing the opacity where we'll lose those nice clouds, let's create a curves layer, clip it to the darker exposure and just brighten it up slightly. You see, we still keep those clouds and the movement in the sky. And the trees still look perfectly natural. By the way, if I were to process this image a little bit more, I would probably get rid of this sandy bank down here, this stony bank. And I do that by selecting all these exposures, right click and choosing link layers. Then I press Command T or Control and T, right click and choose distort. And with distort, you see I'm dragging out those stones. But I'm going to have to correct the distortion there by bringing up this left-hand corner as well. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit more just to get rid of the rest of those stones. And just pulling it down slightly. And by default, we are bringing these foreground stones closer, which in turn gives us a closer feel for the landscape itself. And I think that's quite an improvement. So those are a few examples on how to deal with moving objects, how we can't fix moving objects, and also how we get around the fact that something might look like there's movement between exposures, but in fact we just need to adjust the raw files a little bit.